I'm Meg Maggio. I own a gallery in Beijing called Peking Fine Arts. And it's a gallery that represents contemporary artists from China and other Asian countries, primarily from China, but we also work with artists from Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and overseas Chinese living. We have artists who live in London, New York. I think never underestimate the vast cultural and linguistic divide. And it's very difficult to surmount that divide. It's, it's not one big happy global village. There's a lot of cultural and linguistic differences, and never underestimate the enormity of miscommunication. And if you look at the Chinese artists that most of us know and recognize, they're immigrant artists. They're artists who live in France, or they live in New York, or they live in London, or they live in Amsterdam, or they live in Berlin. They're Chinese artists who have immigrated. The artists who you typically see here, Sai Guochang, he has a place in the Lower East Side. Xu Bing, he has a place in Brooklyn. Yan Peiming lives in Dijon for 20 years. Huang Yongping lives in Paris. Wang Du lives in Paris. Sort of the artists that we are, Guenda lives in Brooklyn Heights. The artists who we are most familiar with and have really had a big success, most of them tend to be Chen Zhen, who died a few years ago, but he immigrated to France as well. The most well-known Chinese artists were immigrants. It's very difficult for the guys who stay at home and don't practice their English and don't ever learn to speak English to have an international success. It's going to take longer. It's simply because of these, geographic, linguistic, and cultural differences. And those differences are great. And I think, I admire the curators who work hard to overcome those distances. It's easy to deal with some, I think in New York, one of the negative things is that when people want to be international, when curators and museums want to be international, oftentimes they never leave the 5 boroughs. They're talking about artists who live here. And I understand that economic resources are limited. And it's easier to deal with the Chinese guy who's in Brooklyn Heights than the Chinese guy who's in Sichuan province. But maybe the guy who's in Sichuan province is the real genius. 2 of the artists that I represent are exhibiting in shows here in New York that opened, luckily, in the same week. One of them is Wang Qingsong, and Wang Qingsong, it's his first solo exhibition with the museum in New York. So he has a solo exhibition at the International Center of Photography, which is basically sort of introducing his practice to a wider American audience. People have had a taste of his work, but they haven't had a chance to sort of look at his work in more depth. And I think that's going to happen a lot now. You're going to see, I think the era of showing big traveling group Chinese shows is over, and now you're going to see more concentrated solo exhibitions and solo projects, so people can start to understand the individual Chinese artists on a deeper level. Someone like Wang Qingsong, his work really resonates and has become part of the iconography, and people recognize his work. He does stage performance color photographs, often involving hundreds of models, nude and clothed. And he works really like a film director in film studio settings and makes these massive tableaux of live models and then shoots them like a film director. But then there's also some younger generation of artists, mainly born in the 70s and 80s, who are very independent and sort of going on their own paths and getting very quickly integrated into the international contemporary art scene. They're not part of any groups of Chinese artists. They're working on a much more individual practice, an individual basis. And one of them is someone like Liu Di. Liu Di is still a graduate student at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. He hasn't finished his master's degree, and he's won this wonderful international art prize. He'd never left the country. He didn't have a passport. So the first time he left the country was to go to Lausanne to exhibit his work, and the first time he came to the United States was in December to Miami to pick up his prize. So that, to me, that's sort of international conversation where you really get these guys who somehow they're engaged in an international conversation, but from their home. Well, I think Ai Weiwei's been in the news because, first and foremost, he's a fabulous artist. And he's a very exciting architect as well. And the thing that's most important and that everyone's most proud of is that Ai Weiwei has the Turbine Hall project at the Tate Modern in the UK. And his sunflower seed project with the hand-painted ceramic sunflowers, I was there for the opening in September, and it was fabulous. It was just such it was a very emotional moment to see the Turbine Hall covered with Chinese sunflower seeds, which is sort of the cheapest, most basic food that people have, with a beer or with a cup of tea. When you can't afford anything, you could always afford to munch on sunflower seeds. And it somehow resonates with this sense of a poor background that somehow we got through, and everyone still had managed to have fun, even though they had very little money. And this sort of symbolism that really goes back to the years of poverty in China, and then to resurrect this piece, this sort of, every Chinese person looks at sunflower seeds and they understand it means the years of living very lean. It immediately resonates. It has a very visceral, very profound meaning for every person from mainland China. And to see that in the Turbine Hall of the Tate Modern was so moving and so wonderful. And I think sometimes with Ai Weiwei, although he is truly an activist artist, we forget what a fabulous art practice he has and how absolutely wonderful his work as an artist is. Last year, he had 2 major solo exhibitions, museum exhibitions, before Tate. In 2010 and 2009, he had a solo project at the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, and he had a solo, even bigger solo project at the Munich Museum, at the Kunstmuseum in Munich. And these were major exhibitions. See, one of the problems is, and now the Tate Modern, one of the problems is he hasn't had a major solo show in the United States yet. And until that happens, people here don't really understand his practice. All they know is, his studio got ripped down in Shanghai, and something's going on there, and it looks a little bit political. Or they know his work helping the families who lost their children during the Sichuan earthquake. And those are all wonderful things that he feels very strongly about. Or they know his twittering, because he's been using his twittering as a sort of form of mass mobilization ever since the Sichuan earthquake 2 years ago. But they lose sight of the fact that he's a fabulous artist, and he has absolutely fabulous artwork. And I think that's the most important thing that people should be thinking about when they think of Ai Weiwei. What's happening in China is that there's a huge amount of new young collectors, and they feel very excited and very responsible for supporting their own artists. And what we're seeing is an explosion in the growth of private art museums. So collectors who are building their own museums and building collections. And also what you see in China is, let's say, the Fortune 100 or the Fortune 500 who are doing international business. They start to appreciate the fact that their office should have some really fantastic artworks that are not only Chinese but also international. And they're very curious and excited about sort of culture, contemporary culture around the world, and they're not afraid to explore art from countries all over the world. And I think there's a terrific enthusiasm in China for collecting art at the moment. Pace is looking for new space in Hong Kong. They have their space in Beijing. They'll keep their space in Beijing and hopefully open a second space in Hong Kong. Manuel Perrotin hired someone full-time in Hong Kong, and she's part of her job is to look for a new space for Manuel Perrotin in Hong Kong. Gagosian opened in Hong Kong on the 18th of January with a big party that everyone was dying to get an invitation to. It's a little bit amusing to watch this. Someone could make a fabulous reality television show about all of this. But of course we're happy, because at the end of the day, we hope that they raise the quality bar and that they sort of get engaged in the local language and the local art scene. But very few of those galleries are representing Chinese artists. Emmanuel Perrotin doesn't represent any Chinese artists. Gagosian doesn't represent any Chinese artists. Pace represents Zhang Xiaogang, which is a really great thing. And they've tried to work with a few other artists. And of course, they represent Zhang Huan, who also used to live in Flushing. So there's a lot of, they're trying, they're sort of feeling things out and seeing how it goes. And I think they're right. I think it's the right moment to be there. Particularly Beijing and Hong Kong, both of these cities provide not only an international platform for local artists, but also a regional platform. So you've got Korean galleries in Hong Kong and Beijing, Japanese galleries, Indian galleries, Indonesian galleries, Thai galleries. Beijing is different because Beijing is where the artists are concentrated. It's a little bit like what you said about Brooklyn. All the artists live here, all the studio space is here. That's how Beijing is. Hong Kong is the marketplace. It's, all the Sotheby's and Christie's have concentrated all of their Asian sales in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, to be fair, is fabulous for logistics, fabulous for insurance. Things work very smoothly and very conveniently and very efficiently in Hong Kong. I don't think you buy on ethnicity. I don't think you buy on geography. I don't think you buy on someone's passport. I don't wake up in the morning and say, today I'm going to start collecting Polish artists. I'm going to start collecting Argentinian artists. I don't believe at all in this sort of model. I think what's interesting is people who are interested in emerging art, they look at artists from around the world of a certain generation or a certain age group, and you look at an artist, so-called emerging artists from anywhere in the world, and you notice they're engaged in similar conversations. It's very exciting to see what interests these guys share and don't share. And I think if you're interested in supporting emerging art, you can't avoid China. It's very simple. It's the big elephant in the room. There's no way to avoid it.